My esteemed senior colleague, Major Dalbir Singh, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here to the One Globe Uniting Knowledge Communities conference here in New Delhi. Invariably, February is fairly warm and sunny in Delhi, but today it seemed to have turned out differently, though I see the sun coming out towards the beginning of the afternoon. I was asking my esteemed senior colleague, Major Dalbir Singh, that what exactly is the remit of this conference? And what he told me was that we seek to synergize, we seek to unite, and we seek a convergence between knowledge, institutions which are the repositories of those knowledge, and people who both create and disseminate that knowledge across the world. And I think in the past 2 decades, you've seen a fundamental transformation in the information architecture of the world. The emergence of the internet towards the middle of the 90s. Now, there are a lot of people who take credit for that invention, but be that as it may, I think has fundamentally and completely transformed the way we interact, the way we consume, and the manner in which we disseminate knowledge. I've often thought to myself that the internet was perhaps the most audacious experiment in anarchy, and it has succeeded. The cyberspace represents the largest possible ungoverned place on planet Earth. Never before in the history of mankind or humankind, so much of power has been available to so many people concurrently at so many places. There's possibly more digital content which is put out every 2 days than from the dawn of civilization till about 2003. So what you've seen really evolving over the last 2 decades is a physical civilization which took shape, root and form over the millennia, and a virtual civilization which is evolving. And at the intersection or at the convergence of these two is really where knowledge communities or knowledge creators really reside. The difficulty is that we seem to take a lot of this development for granted. We do believe that the internet, as the global commons that we know it, is something which is here to stay. But there is an inherent and a fundamental danger. And the inherent and fundamental danger is that this truly epoch-making and transformational experience, which all of us have gone through over the last 2 decades, may also, in the absence of the emergence of agreed rules of engagement, possibly lead to or possibly have a demise or a collapse during our lifetimes itself. China has very successfully firewalled the internet. They've almost converted it into an intranet. And therefore, the possibility of the balkanization of the net based upon a shared value system or possibly strategic hegemony or even a convergence of economic interests is therefore not an unforeseen possibility. And that's why all of us who do believe in the freedom of speech and expression and who do hold that the freedom of this global commons is something which is uniquely essential for the further growth of creativity and for both the material and the mental development of humankind, must persevere to see that these common rules of engagement emerge. There are those who are advocates or who are absolutists, who believe that any conversation about agreed rules of engagement is really a subterfuged attempt to try and contain the freedom of the net. And I think they possibly could not be more far off the mark, because the reality is that while the net is a very, very useful instrument of not only disseminating knowledge, of making friends, of building communities, but there is also the dark net. There is also the spectre of the hidden people. And there are all kinds of pernicious and subversive tendencies which need to be dealt with so that the sanctity of the cyberspace in its pure absolutism can be maintained. The reason why I started off with the net when we talk about knowledge is that for centuries there has been the creation of knowledge, the transformation of knowledge, or the transmission of knowledge from one generation to another. But because of geographical differences, because of distances, at times the passage of, more often than not, the passage has been siloized, going from generation to generation, possibly in the same country or in the same community. But for the first time, we've got the opportunity to be able to horizontally proliferate it in real time. You had books, you had newspapers, you had other means of communication, but each of them had its limitation. The digital space has completely and absolutely broken the barriers of that limitation. And I think that's been the single biggest transformation which has succeeded in possibly uniting knowledge communities across the world. The other question is that what do we use this knowledge for? Even today, notwithstanding whatever progress, whatever advancement humankind may have made, for people, and especially for young people, the fundamental challenge still remains as to how that knowledge can be translated into making them employable and making them skillable. So therefore, communities around the world, and especially those countries which have stolen a march over the others, or which for historical reasons have had legacy advantages in being able to create knowledge, must try and see that this is shared in an equivocal manner. This is shared in a non-partisan manner with their less privileged counterparts around the world. After the end of the Second World War, and with the emergence of the Cold War, you also concurrently saw over those 50 or 60 years the globalization of capital flows. And it all finally came to fruition when in 1989 the former Soviet Union and East Europe collapsed. And strategic thinkers like Francis Fukuyama predicted that this was the end of history. And for a lot of us, we felt that this would be the logical next step, whereby after the globalization of capital flows, there would be a globalization of the flow of labor. But unfortunately, the events of the first decade of the 21st century, the 9/11 and the events which unfolded after that, have made physical barriers or Westphalian barriers even go further up rather than coming further down in the name of security. I'm not saying that those concerns are invalid, but fortunately you had a technological transformation whereby knowledge, skills, jobs could move without people physically having to move. But I think the time has come for a very serious and a very informed debate as to how, in this given paradigm, can we really globalize labor flows, because there is an inherent inequity whereby large parts of the world's population continue to occupy very small parts of the world's geographical area. And at some point in time, if there has to be an equitable and an optimal utilization of resources, I think the advantage which knowledge provides will then have to be leveraged, will then have to be harnessed as to how we as a civilization can then move to the next level. The third and the final thing, or the third and the final thought, which I would like to share with you, is that on one hand, while the entire information paradigm and its transformation has opened up new avenues, especially for the younger generation, we are also confronted with a new specter. And the new specter is the phenomena of the information overload, whereby there is just huge amounts of information, huge amounts of knowledge, which is being thrust real time 24/7 onto very young and impressionable minds, which at times do not have the ability to absorb, synthesize, and really make some coherent sense out of it. So while not restricting or in any way inhibiting either the creation of knowledge or the dissemination of knowledge, I think thought leaders, people who are at the cutting edge of this debate, must also focus on as to how our succeeding generations really have to deal with this entire specter of an information overload. Coupled with that, of course, is this entire desire to be the first to put that news or put that bit of information out into the public space. And there I feel that media companies, and we have a very, very vibrant media landscape in India. We have about 150 million television homes, which covers more or less about 2/3 of the Indian population. We have 798 television channels at the last count. We, in India, have a myriad number of newspaper publications, I think about 12,000 of them, which are printed on a daily basis. And then, of course, the whole new media, which is a different animal altogether. But this entire paradigm of information creation and dissemination is unfortunately underpinned by a very faulty revenue model. For example, if you look at the broadcasting industry in India, The broadcasting industry is completely and absolutely dependent for its revenue model on advertising. And advertising, unfortunately, is measured by a very faulty paradigm, which of course is under litigation in the Delhi High Court, so therefore I would not want to dwell at length on it, but which is called the television rating points. And that, to a very great extent, is responsible for the sensationalism and for the dog-eat-dog discourse that we see play itself out almost on a daily basis. You know, as someone who's been a card-carrying member of the blood sport which passes off as primetime news on our television every night, you know, often, you know, I reflect to myself as to whether we are really serving the cause of disseminating anything worthwhile in terms for people to absorb, or are we just primetime WWF kind of entertainment for people, you know, while they go about having their final drink before dinner? So there is a need that people who are in this business and people who have over a period of time acquitted themselves extremely honorably need to also introspect and to see as to how we can bring about or how do we sort of redesign the hardware or redesign the entire architecture which underpins the entire information revolution as it has unfolded. I know this is the valedictory session, but maybe for a future day and time, I would just like to leave these thoughts with you, because if there is one thing in the world which acts as a leveler and which is able to not only reduce differences and bring about equities between generations or even between people of the same generation who may not have been born to more to as privileged circumstances, is perhaps the entire phenomena called knowledge. And I think it is very important that all of us who have a stake in preserving it must also seriously introspect as to how, while preserving it, while advancing it, we can also make it more responsible. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.